Cybility Savvy, the quickest way to go from cyber confused to cyber savvy.
Hello, and welcome to Cybility Savvy, the show that demystifies cybersecurity for not-for-profit boards and leaders. I'm your host, Michala Liavaag. Our guest today is Sabrina Segal, who is the Global Head of Integrity, Risk and Compliance Support Services at JA Worldwide, a not-for-profit organisation. Hi, Sabrina. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Michala. Thank you so much for having me today.
JA Worldwide is a non-profit focused on supporting entrepreneurship, financial literacy, and work skills readiness to young people around the globe. Sabrina is a licensed attorney, certified fraud examiner, and has more than 15 years of experience in the non-profit sector in various leadership roles across support services and program design and delivery. So for those in our audience that don't know you, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
As you mentioned, I'm a licensed attorney by training, but please don't hold that against me. I know a lot of people who look at risk in a slightly different way feel that this profession is overwhelmed with auditors, accountants, professional services, consultants, and lawyers. But what I have learned is that being able to fall back on my legal background, particularly reading, writing, thinking, kind of challenging positions a little bit in a more tactful way, have really helped me in risk. So I worked as a traditional lawyer for several years before I left and moved into the nonprofit area, which is where I've spent the rest of my career. And it's been fantastic. I've been a legal advisor on rule of law programs. I have been a country director focusing on capacity strengthening for small NGOs. And now I'm working with a fantastic nonprofit where we're helping young people chase down their dreams of entrepreneurship all over the world. But risk and compliance and integrity has been a common theme throughout all of the work I've done. And it's something that I really, really enjoy doing. And particularly bringing the voice of the third sector now, nonprofits, to the risk conversation is something I feel is really important and we need to do a lot more.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. You have integrity in your job title, and I don't tend to see that around much. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
When JA reached out to me, the position that was originally offered was, Chief Risk Officer. And I said, I want to change the title. In my opinion, if your title is Chief Risk Officer or head of risk or whatever, the organization will look at you and say, oh, well, you are the risk person, so I don't have to do anything, right? So Sabrina's here. No one else has to worry about risk. And I specifically requested my title be the global head of integrity, risk, and compliance in that order, because that's the order that I personally believe is the most important. And then I specifically asked for support services at the end to communicate to the organization that I am here to support you. I'm a facilitator. I am here to help you improve your skills in these three areas. I'm here to hold your hand as we go through these challenges, but you all are the ones that need to actually do it. Junior Achievement has over 300, I think almost 350 locations across 117 countries. We reach 100 million young people every year. It's a massive organization, and there's no way one of me could do all of that. So integrity is where it all starts. And that's why it's the first thing in the title.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. And I also think it's also, I suppose, in a way, very timely as well, because the not-for-profit sector has taken a little bit of a battering over the past few years from that integrity point of view. You just mentioned that, you transitioned into the not-for-profit sector. What was it that sort of drove you to do that?
I started out of law school working as a civil servant in the U.S. government. So I worked at the U.S. Department of State. I worked at USAID. I worked at a few other agencies in oversight and legal roles. So, I never was really, in the private sector, so to speak. I had one role where I was working in a private sector consultancy focusing on international development. But, other than that, I've been in the public sector or the third sector. For me, it was sort of what I always wanted to do. I never went to law school because I wanted to go be a partner at a big law firm. I was always much more interested in public service. I was able to get a fellowship into the US government, which was really exciting for me. And then while particularly I was with the Department of State and USAID, I just got so much more exposure to implementing partners. And while I was there, I was able to travel a bit. I was able to travel out to different missions and offices and see how the programs are being implemented, but there was
Yeah.
always that part of me that said, I really want to go out and implement these programs. And so I was able to transition really out of the government and into the third sector, I guess would be the transition, when I left Washington, D.C. and I moved to Rome. And that was my first overseas role, and haven't been back to the US since.
Wow, excellent. Just thinking the fact that you have worked these different geographies, do you see much difference in the approach to risk across them?
It's an interesting question. You can break risk down a lot of different ways. You can slice and dice it. I mean, there's cultural elements, there are core objective elements, depending on the organization that you're working for. And there's also kind of maturity and sophistication elements too, where, certainly industries like banking, medical sector, major manufacturing are much more sophisticated and mature in the area of risk than you would have in a nonprofit, in an NGO. One of the things I like to say, though, is there is not one charity on the face of the earth that decided to become a charity because they wanted to meet the donor's compliance requirements, right? Like no one is ever going to do that. Charities and nonprofits and NGOs become what they are because they see a need in their community. And they see a way to serve the people in their community. And that's their focus. And it should be. One of the things that I have seen that's been really challenging in the different environments I've worked in is the level of sophistication of the entity, of the nonprofit entity, is where you end up with challenges with risk. You have large international NGOs, and they have more resources. They have the ability to throw more resources at the risk issue. And then you have small ones who are extremely valuable when it comes to program impact because they have access to underserved communities. But, a procurement policy is the last thing that they ever thought that they would need to write. What I think we need to do in the nonprofit sector, particularly around risk, is, help the smaller organizations raise their capacity, strengthen their capacity, because we know that strong risk management produces better quality outcomes. So we want to help them raise their ability to do objective-centered risk management, which is what I like to practice. But so many times donors and large organizations confuse that with compliance. And a large organization will say, well, we're raising the capacity of this small, community-based organization because we've taught them how to do our tick box exercise on procurement or our tick box exercise on financial management. And in reality, all you're teaching them how to do is fill out your own forms. You're not really getting them to understand the concepts behind what you're asking them to do. So it's a long way of answering, in the different places I've been, it all depends.
It's really interesting you raised the point about the compliance focus, because certainly I see that a lot from a cybersecurity point of view, that people are kind of like, what's the minimum I need to do to be compliant with X, Y, Z, rather than thinking about the actual risks to the organisation in terms of achieving what they're there to deliver. And you mentioned a moment there about objective-centred risk management. For those who aren't familiar with this concept, would you like to just tell us a little bit about it?
So objective-centered risk management, it's an approach that I've developed based on some of Tim Leach's writing. If you're on LinkedIn, definitely check out Tim Leach. He has been focusing for many, many, many decades on how to move people away from tick box exercises and, red, yellow, and green boxes, heat maps, all of that junk, into more actionable and applicable, really useful risk management. And so what I've developed over my time working in the NGO world is a process that is integrated into project management. So my PMs love this approach. It's not a bolt on, it's a built in, is what I like to say. And basically when you do your analysis, throw away your risk matrices, throw away your risk appetite statements, throw away your risk registers, they're useless. You start with your objectives. So if you're an NGO, you're designing a program and you've got your logical framework, your log frame, you're going to go to your outcome or your output level, because that's about approximately where you're going to find your objectives. You're going to pull out what the objectives are of your program. Now, support services can do the same thing, but you'll do it slightly differently. But from a program point of view, you're going to pull out those objectives and you're going to put them right in the middle of a modified mind map. Around your objective, then you're going to identify the risks. You're going to ask yourself, what are the risks that will prevent me from achieving this objective? From your risks, then you will have little dots that will be your causes. What are the things that cause these risks that will prevent me from achieving my objectives? And then from those little dots out there, you'll have dots on the outside, and you're going to then have little lines that connect your preparation steps to your causes, to your risks, to your objective. The key here then is because you're starting with your objective, you're not starting with a long list of all the horrible things that might happen on a heat map or a risk register. You're starting with your objective. When you end up managing all of this at the other end, you're managing the objective. You're not just managing a long list of risks. The other thing about this approach too is that the preparation steps that you have around the outside of your mind map, what you're going to do is take each one of those, put them into a spreadsheet and price them. And you're going to say, this is how much each preparation step will cost us, whether it's staff time, whether it's new software, hardware, whatever it is. This is what each one's going to cost us. That then actually becomes your risk appetite statement. You are going to take that price list, give it to your management and say, if you want us to achieve this objective, we need to be sure we have these resources. Are you a go or a no-go? It operationalizes risk. It really ties it very, very closely. It ties it directly into decision making, and it makes it much more useful for NGOs. Don't run a Monte Carlo simulation. Don't bother with heat maps. If you follow through on this mind map when it comes to objective-centered risk management, half of the work is done for you.
It's a really interesting approach that I think can work really well, especially for the smaller organizations who don't have the resources.
So, when you were mentioning how cyber has become just such a tick box exercise, the first thing that came to mind was GDPR. People get so scared and get so kind of, oh, it's digital, it's electronic, it's cyber, I don't understand it. And what I try and do when I'm in a risk role or in a country direct role or anything like that was say, how does it practically apply, again, to our programming? Take it back to our programming, take it back to our objectives. And one of the things that I always make sure I do, particularly on activity risk assessments, is, we ask about, number one, are we taking pictures of people? How do we protect people's privacy, protect their identity, right? It's for me, it's more about that, because you're dealing with vulnerable populations, children, vulnerable adults. We need to be good stewards of that sensitive information. So how do we do it? How are we getting permissions? Do people understand the permissions when they give us permissions to take their pictures, use a quote, use a recording, whatever it is? If they change their mind later, have we made it easy for them to get back in touch with us so we can pull these things down because they've changed their mind? But the number one question that I always ask my program team is, can somebody continue to participate in this activity if they say no? Because the scary thing, right, put yourself in the position of a refugee who wants to engage in, a livelihoods program and get a micro grant in order to start a business. You are at the bottom of that power structure and you're given this permission slip. In your mind, you're saying, well, I have to agree to this or I can't participate. In all of my risk assessments and with my PMs, I was always very clear. I said, number one, do we have a way for these people to participate in these activities if they say no? And the answer for that should always be yes. And they need to know that they can say no and still participate. It empowers them. It levels the power dynamic playing field. It also makes sure that we understand what their wishes are and we're honoring them. And so for me, particularly when it came to privacy and images, quotes, and recordings, I had to really get my PMs and my field teams to think about it level when it comes to power dynamics and not necessarily just GDPR compliance.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting, the point that you raise around, again, it's that thinking, it's the changing the way of thinking about something that I think is so crucial, not just in the sort of data protection and privacy space, but also from a cybersecurity perspective. When would you say was your kind of aha moment about the importance of cybersecurity and including that as a risk for an organization?
When I was working in the US government, I was supporting cybersecurity audits. So I really understood it from that end. But I think the most aha moment I had was I was working with an organization, I won't mention which one, to protect their privacy, but I was working with an organization that was a victim of a ransomware attack. Luckily, because I was sort of away from the HQ, we were running kind of almost a separate network. And I had put in place on our network a particular kind of security, and we weren't really affected. But a lot of other offices and headquarters were, and they couldn't get to their files, they couldn't do their work. Always knew that could happen, but it was just a really heartbreaking wake up call. And also to me saying, look, these guys that are out there, they're just doing this for money. They don't care if they're going after charities. They don't care if what your organization does is to help people, right? They don't care. And that was a wake up call for me, which made me realize that nonprofits and NGOs and charities are really low hanging fruit. And this is an area that we have got to get our arms around. And I also then at that point embraced the phrase, do what you do best and outsource the rest. And the good news is that there are a lot of organizations out there that help nonprofits improve on just the basics, right? Making sure they've got firewalls, making sure they're changing their passwords every 90 days, making sure that they're patched, right? I mean, all the basic stuff. But again, I challenge you to find a charity that established themselves because they wanted to do cybersecurity all day. I mean, again, this is not why a charity, invents itself, but it's an important thing now. And especially because so much is moving to digital. For me, that was sort of my wake up call, was when it came so close to my office, but then seeing just the suffering that was going through, and the organizations really trying to figure out, how do they move forward and continue their work? Do they pay the ransom? Do we have insurance? I mean, what does that mean? And it was heartbreaking more than anything else. Because it's not like we were a bank. We barely had any money, but it really froze our operations, and it was tough.
One of the things I hear quite a bit is, the why would anybody hack us or target us? The reality of the situation is quite often they're just collateral damage. It's just so easy for the criminals to throw stuff out there and see who bites, sort of easy moneymaker for them. And I agree with you, it's absolutely heartbreaking, which is one of the reasons that we at Stability are really keen on helping people sort of up their sort of cybersecurity risk protections and awareness about what they can do to help themselves. So no, it's a difficult one for the sector, it really is. Think back to your first role when you took the lead for risk management. What sort of challenges did you have to overcome in that, or was the organization already fully bought into it?
I don't think any organization is fully bought into risk, even the mature ones. The number one challenge I think we have with risk, and the landscape is shifting, because I think when sort of the CRO role and risk as a thing kind of like appeared on the scene, it was very siloed. It was very, well, this is risk, and we're going to do these Monte Carlo simulations, and we're going to do these heat maps, and here's your risk register, and right. And I think very quickly, and I'm glad very quickly, organizations realized that risk cannot be siloed. It has to be cross-functional. And so for me, the biggest challenge is making sure that the organization understands that you are not the risk person. And particularly in the nonprofit sector, having somebody who's dedicated to risk is very unusual because we don't have the resources. Risk is usually thrown under finance. The program design team is asked to fill in a risk checklist by the donor, and so they just kind of do it based on what they know. So lots of nonprofits do not actually have risk roles. And so I think one of the challenge, if there's nonprofits out there who are listening to this and saying, we actually think we really do need a risk role, is make sure that your organization understands that when you establish this role is going to be cross-cutting. It's going to be horizontal, not vertical. You have to set the expectations within the organization so that when that person sits in that seat, whether they come from outside or they come from inside, people understand that role is going to be interacting and overlapping. A big challenge that risk managers have, there's a lot of turf wars, and there's a lot of people within organizations who have set up kingdoms, and they don't necessarily like it when you knock on their door or when things overlap. But what people have to realize is that for risk to be done really well, it has to overlap. And the risk person is not there to take your work away from you. The risk person is there to be an extension of your team. And that's something that I say a lot, and I say it over and over again. And I get tired of hearing myself say it, but I know I need to keep saying it. Whenever I talk to my regional offices, my country offices, whoever it is, program implementation team, to say, think of me as an extension of your team. I am another set of hands. I am not here to tell you what to do. I mean, I don't have a budget. I don't have any authority. I can't tell you what to do, even if I wanted to. But what I'm here to do is be a facilitator. I'm here to support. I'm here to provide tips and tools and tricks that are going to make your life easier. But I myself, I'm not going to be able to do risk. It's you all that need to do risk. When I was with Save the Children, my former employer, I and my team made up these stickers, and we had this 6 different stickers, and they said things like, I'm a risk manager too, got risk, I'm here to help, all these little things, and it was in English and Arabic, and it was great, and we got people to stick it on their laptops, to stick it on their shirt, I mean, whatever, and everybody was a risk manager. It wasn't just our team, and so that to me was probably the biggest challenge moving into risk, was getting the organization to understand that this is a cross-functional, it is not a silo. And leadership has to set that expectation with the existing units before you introduce risk, or else you're going to be fighting those turf wars before you even get into your subject matter.
Yeah, I'm just thinking back. I've seen exactly what you've described quite a few times. And again, we suffer the same thing in cybersecurity. You hire somebody for cybersecurity and they're like, okay, yeah, no, that person's dealing with cybersecurity. None of the rest of us need to worry about it now. But fundamentally in cybersecurity, certainly in the GRC space that I specialize in, it is absolutely all about risk day in, day out. And you have to operationalize it, which is exactly what you're saying as well about getting it down to the people who are doing the doing. They're the ones who can identify the risks and think about what to do about them. It's not all down to this particular individual.
Absolutely. I mean, if one of the people in the organization finds a USB stick in the parking lot and decides to plug it into the networked computer at work, I mean, you're done, right? You're done. Everybody is a cybersecurity expert,
exactly.
Right? I mean, everybody is part of this team. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I'd always say when we had that huge transition with COVID and people working from home was that, you can't rely on the central security team anymore. You all need to become your own security teams in the home. One of the things about cybersecurity is it's always changing. Day in, day out, there's new things coming along, that we have to address and think about. And I'm just wondering, how do you sort of stay up to date with risk? What's the sort of pace of change like?
I think the pace of change in risk can be in a matter of nanoseconds, or it can be glacial, depending on your approach. There are definitely people in the risk profession who love, their risk registers, and, you will pry them from their cold, dead hands, even though we know that the further away your tools get from your objectives and your decision making, the worse your outcomes are. People are still, it's their security blanket. They love them, right? Now, I do think that it is moving in the right direction. I see a lot of people, particularly on LinkedIn, writing a lot of really interesting thoughts and theories and approaches. There's more people doing, for example, academic research and writing in the area of risk. That's not something that you even saw, I think, 5 years ago. It just wasn't a thing to do. So it's great that we're getting so much more data, but the risk practitioners have to be open to it. Like every other profession, and skill set, it has to change, and it's changing for the better. You can't just take the same approach to risk across all sectors, across all industries, because it's contextual and it's different. And so while a Monte Carlo simulation might work really well in the aviation industry, it's not going to work well in the nonprofits. We're actually really lucky. We have so many approaches and tools that we can use. There's so much out there. I mean, I love reading on LinkedIn. I love reading academic journals now. And even just reading the news and seeing things that are happening in banks, in NGOs, fraud and corruption, all that. You see it's happening, and then you see how people are responding to it.
What traits do you think help a risk management professional? And do you think that the professional industry bodies have a role to play here?
Okay, so the first question is, what skill set do I think would be, or flexibility and skill set? So, I mean, yes to flexibility, absolutely, right? I mean, because one of the things that I always like to say is risk is dynamic. Risk is not static. Part of the reason why I really abhor these old approaches and tools is because they're static. A heat map is only as good as the minute that you put it together. The next minute, it's out of date. And imagine if you only pull that matrix down once a quarter and you update it for your project. I mean, what's the use? Why bother? Right. So risk is dynamic. And so flexibility is absolutely really important. I like to talk a lot about being agile. And I know agile is a big thing in tech, right? But I'm not necessarily talking about agile in the project management sense, but being able to pivot, being able to adapt, and being able to accelerate when you need to. We are not going to be able to predict everything that's going to happen. But if we have our 3 R's in place, if we are able to recognize and kind of see what's going on in our landscape, if we're able to have some responses ready to go, we're not going to be able to develop responses for 100% of the situations. But if we can develop responses even for 40 or 50% of the situations, we're doing really well. And then finally, we need to build in that resilience. And that's where that flexibility comes from. And that's where that agility comes from. And, in the nonprofit world, I actually think we are at an advantage because we are so chronically underfunded, understaffed, and under-resourced that we have to be creative. We have to be resilient. We have to be agile every single day. So we are actually in a really strong position when it comes to responding to risk because we have to do it, not necessarily respond to risk, but we have to be creative all the time. Where I do think we can improve in the nonprofit sector is looking at it in a bit of a more formal way. Let's actually sit down and think about our approach to risk, incorporating all of these other wonderful creative things that we have the ability to do. But let's think about it in a little bit more of a structured way. If we can bring more structure to the risk conversation, we're going to be in a better place. So skill sets, any and all. So I'm actually right now in the process of creating a community of practice at JA worldwide. And I'm asking for representatives from all of our member offices. And at first people were saying, well, do you want our CFO? Do you want someone from our finance office? And I had 2 criteria. My first criteria was I want somebody who's passionate and interested in integrity, risk, and compliance. I don't care where they come from, but I want them to have an interest and a curiosity. And number 2, I want them to be in a position where they can take what they're learning in the community of practice back to their organization and start to implement it. The more diverse, the better it is. But those are my 2 requirements. So, I think that everybody can be a risk manager. Everyone needs to be a risk manager. And so I don't necessarily think that there has to be a particular skill set to get into risk. Now, your third question was the regulatory bodies. So I'll get to that one too. Yeah, absolutely. I think that regulatory bodies, but let me actually take this from less regulatory bodies and more donor sides, right? So it's relevant to nonprofits. What I would love donors to do is 2 things. One, genuinely take risk management seriously. Don't just add it, don't to your, say in your proposals, add an appendix that gives us your risk assessment. I mean, that's fine. Any organization can do that, but that doesn't really genuinely communicate that the donor kind of has their arms around what risk really is. And fund it. Fund capacity strengthening, not only for your prime and your implementing partners, but for yourselves. All of this talk about localization and engaging, the local partners on the ground is all well and good, but donors are not choosing to accept more risk. They are continuing to do the risk transfer to the larger kind of middleman, larger INGOs, and saying, we want you to work with more smaller partners, but you still have to meet our compliance requirements. And you can't have your cake and eat it too. And so, if donors are serious about localization and about getting smaller and more on the ground partners engaged, donors will have to accept a higher risk because simply, again, no charity establishes itself because they say they want to meet the USAID or the DFID, or whatever compliance requirements. And they're ridiculous. Donors, not so much regulatory bodies in the third sector space, but donors need to genuinely have a real frank conversation among themselves about what it means to accept more risk if they want to have more localized and impactful programming. So that's who I would talk to more than regulators.
I'm just thinking, are there any particular, where would you go to reach that donor audience to get that message out to them?
It's a great question. I mean, when the grand bargain came down several years ago and localization was kind of part of that conversation during the grand bargain, they were all sitting there around the table. The Scandinavian countries are actually pretty good about kind of moving in the right direction. But overall, on the grand scheme of things, they're kind of smaller donors. I really think that you'd have to have the Americans, the Aussies, the UN, for example, right? I mean, the UN compliance requirements are crazy. You'd really have to have almost another summit on localization, which, we have a lot. We have a lot of summits on localization in the humanitarian and the international development sphere, but risk is not on the agenda, and risk transfer isn't on the agenda. And I'll tell you why, because donors, I don't think, want to be put on the spot. And I get it. They're fighting their own battles with their own funders, and it's really hard for them to go to these budget holders and say, give us more money, and we can't guarantee impact, we can't guarantee output, and oh yeah, the risk might be higher. So I get it. But then at the same time, if you're going to, have these big statements about localization and how we want to engage the global south more, how we want to decolonize aid, I mean, all of these really valuable conversations, you have to have risk on that agenda too. And I just haven't seen an honest conversation about putting risk on the agenda so that at least we're all on the same page. The other thing too, if you flip it on its head, if donors aren't willing to accept more risk, then donors should put more resourcing and funding into capacity strengthening, right? So if you don't want to accept more risk, then go downstream and raise the capacity of the smaller organizations that you want to work with. But don't just say, we're not going to give you more money for that, and you still have to meet all these compliance requirements. And oh, by the way, we want you to work with riskier partners. Where would we go to talk to them? I think some of these localization summits, some of these global fundraising summits, you could probably bring this topic up in any humanitarian or international conference. Why not? Why not put risk on the agenda?
And I suppose the answer to that might be people find it scary. They don't like the potential negative outcomes that could arise. So they just like to sort of focus on the positives to get things through. Yeah, it's a difficult one, that one, isn't it, really?
But that's a great point, Michala, that you just raised about how people think of risk as it's being very negative and challenging. The international definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. It's 6 words, right? It doesn't say horrible things that could happen, how your program's going to crash and burn. It's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So when we think about risk, the scary risks are threats. But risk can also be opportunity, right? Risk can be positive. Corporations often say there's no reward without risk because risk is an opportunity. We actually could look at this from a donor point of view, and the donor could position themselves in a way that says, we actually have an opportunity to strengthen these smaller organizations and make them more sustainable by helping them understand how to manage risk. So that could be an opportunity. So we need to think of it in a positive way and not just in a negative way.
Yeah, as human beings, we are wired towards negative rather than positive, aren't we? So it is I think, difficult thing. But obviously, with professionals like yourselves who are able to help reframe, and that's the thing, isn't it? You need people in the organisations who are able to actually help with the reframing. I'd like to sort of bring the conversation back specifically to trustees, because Stability Savvy is for trustees and other leaders to get them thinking about their own organisation. And so I'd be interested in knowing what your kind of thoughts are on where trustees should be in relation to risk, and specifically the sort of decision making, how risk can help with that decision making.
So this is a great question. And obviously boards and trustees have a major role to play when it comes to risk. They say tone at the top, mood in the middle, buzz at the bottom. Right? Well, tone at the top comes from the board. I've been talking to Tim Leach, and I mentioned him earlier, but I'm talking to Tim Leach a lot about board engagement. And one of the things he was saying to me, and he was just like, Sabrina, it's so frustrating. Boards are so much more focused on the oversight role, the kind of, again, box tick, are we doing our financial audit, reporting to the Charities Commission in the UK if we need to do that, much more compliance than it comes to risk. And Tim has some really great thinking and writing that I have I've also kind of really internalized, and I think is super interesting to think about purposeful organizations and purposeful boards, and boards helping organizations identify purpose. And there was a great thing that I read the other day, and it was saying an organization's purpose should have nothing to do with their goals, but everything to do with their values. And again, integrity, values, trickles down to risk, trickles down to compliance. If a board sees its role as opportunity identification and value protection tied in with the organization's purpose, they're going to be so much more valuable than if they are simply ticking a box about the financial audit. I also want trustees to feel empowered to ask for the right information. An organization is never really going to engage in dynamic risk management if the board is not asking for something. If the board continues to ask for a risk register and continues to ask for a quarterly heat map, nothing is going to change. If I was a trustee, I would be asking your organization to demonstrate how their risk management program is dynamic and see what you get. Don't give them any hints. Just say, I want you to explain to me how, you ensure dynamic risk management, and see what they say. The other question that boards can ask is, how does your risk management program tie directly, direct line to objectives? And how does your risk management program tie directly to decision making? If you have to go through a few other areas, it's not direct. And it's not worth your time. So boards need to be having regular conversations. If the organization has a risk role, invite that risk role to come and talk to them, and invite that risk role. If you simply ask those questions and all you're getting back is these standard documents, then you have a problem. But it's a great opportunity to open that dialogue and get them to think differently about things.
Yeah, no, I love that about if the board don't ask, the organisation aren't going to make that change. One of the things we do like to do here is think about those questions they should be challenging the executive with. So thank you for giving them some really practical things that they can take away. You talked about value protection. Is there anything sort of specific in the way that trustees can help do that?
Of course, there's all the traditional things that trustees can do. Trustees can be good advocates for their organization, engage in appropriate advocacy, obviously appropriate fundraising. All trustees should also be donors. Using your position as a trustee to open doors for your organization and identify value creating opportunities, right? Where are some synergies between your organization and a sector that might not have thought about it before? Trustees can definitely, using where they see them, at their level, and say, are there some really creative ways that we can overlap with what our organization does with a sector that maybe would be a non-traditional one, but could create a lot of value depending on what comes out of that relationship?
Do you think there is a role for sort of mentorship between, say, large organizations, small organizations, risk buddies, or something like that?
Risk buddies, that's like a really interesting concept. I had never thought about that before. I'm a big believer in mentorship, right? Regardless of whatever it is. I mean, I think mentorship and coaching and all that stuff is really important. To me, it comes down to capacity strengthening, whether it's individual capacity strengthening, organizational capacity strengthening, whatever it is. The challenge would be pairing up the right individuals and organizations. Again, because risk is really contextual and it's quite particular to the environment that you're working in. I'm not sure, actually, the developments in risk in the nonprofit sector are even mature enough to have a coaching. I think we are all coaching each other. And I think right now at this point, there's still a lot of chaos in our universe. So, we're like right after the Big Bang, where things haven't settled down yet. Planets are smashing into each other and we've got all sorts of things going on, which is exciting. But I think you could probably learn from smaller organizations, as much as you could learn from larger organizations, because we're still figuring it out. I think it's a great idea. I'm just not sure if we're ready for that yet. In the cyber sector, absolutely. I do think that you could benefit from larger, more mature risk entities, companies being able to mentor and support smaller NGOs. Because a ransomware attack is a ransomware attack is a ransomware attack, whether or not you are a bank, a chemical corporation, or you are doing child and maternal health programming in Upper Egypt. So in that area where I think we have subject matter that is quite settled, yes, I absolutely do think that you could benefit from that.
I normally ask people about sort of three things. And I understand for you that rather than going for books, you've opted for something different. Do tell.
So I have three people that I would recommend people to follow on LinkedIn from a risk point of view, because I think that they're doing some really interesting stuff. So I've mentioned Tim Leach a lot, but I will mention him again. Tim Leach. He is the guy that has really come up with the core of objective-centered risk management as I've developed it. He has a great and a lot of materials online about how organizations can switch to thinking more about putting your objectives at the center of risk and then working around there. The other person that I would say is a guy named Warren Black. He writes a lot about complex, wicked problems. They are problems that are multifaceted and dynamic. So once you find the problem, it continues to change. And the last guy that I would say to follow is, his name is Elliot Schreiber, Schreiber. He wrote a book on reputational risk. You've got three main risk categories, right? In generally, you've got financial risk, legal risk, and reputational risk. For nonprofits, the number one risk that we have to be aware of at all times is reputational risk. If we lose our reputation, we're done. Our reputation not only helps us with funders, but it's what gets us in the door with vulnerable populations. It helps us build trust with the beneficiaries that we're trying to reach, the participants in our programs. And as soon as you have an incident, safeguarding incident, child protection incident, a data protection and privacy incident, any of those things that happen, you're done for. And so I strongly suggest following Elliot. He wrote a book about it, but he's got really interesting thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. I'll definitely be doing that. So, what's one question that you wish I'd asked you that I haven't? And if I had, how would you have answered?
I think maybe one question, this is a hard question, I'm kind of glad you didn't answer it, but I'll put it out there, is, how do you win over the boo birds, right? How do you win over the naysayers? How do you win over the people that don't think risk needs to be there, or the ones who feel threatened by risk? One of the things that I've learned is there is a benefit to being a compliance person too, right? But again, compliance, and I've got my little, I've got my triangle, right? You've got integrity at the top of the triangle, risk is at the middle, but compliance is the foundation. And as much as people hate policies and procedures and bureaucracy and all that stuff, and I hate it too, you need to have that there in order to manage your risk, to have integrity, because it comes down to accountability. And if you don't have things written down, then you're going to have a really hard time with accountability. One of the things I found is the people who are going to challenge you fall into one of two camps. One, they're challenging you because they don't like change. They don't understand why you're there. They don't understand the value of having a policy or a process around a certain thing. You can win those people over. It takes time. You have to talk to them. You have to explain how you're there actually to make their life easier. Let's work on this together. I promise you, you won't be reinventing the wheel 1,000 times once we get this down on paper. The other camp are the ones that love having this chaos because they're able to get away with things that they otherwise wouldn't. Those are the ones that are the challenge. Depending on how sophisticated they are, you may never win them over. But what I have also found is the people that work around those people tend to appreciate having those processes and procedures in place, because then it gives them something to sort of hide behind when they're trying to do the right thing. So if you have an individual who is a bit maneuvering and manipulative and likes to have this left and right, but you have people around them that it's driving them crazy, or it's not going to help them at all do their jobs, giving them a written process to point to, right? Because then it's not them saying, hey, we can't do it this way. Then it's them just saying, this is the process. This is where your policies, your processes and procedures are important. Now, you are going to have those people that are going to say, I don't want a bureaucratic state. I want to have, it's going to stifle innovation. We're not going to be able to be creative. Da, 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 da. And I go, please tell me how writing down your process for submitting your reimbursement receipts is going to stifle innovation. I'll wait. The other thing too is I am a big advocate of a strong and frequently used waiver process. There is no way you can ever write policies and procedures and processes that are going to cover 100% of what you're doing. Every one of them should have a statement in there that says, this can be waived by using the following process, right? Have a process for your waivers, make sure it's documented, but allow for it, right? For God's sake, don't stuck people with a process that doesn't work. I mean, for the situation, have a waiver, just document it. That's all I ask, right? So we're not stifling creativity. What we're doing is we're creating repeatable, efficient, effective processes for 80% of what we do. And with waivers,
that's great. Lots of useful tips there. Just thinking then about, again, the trustees and what they can take away. What would be your sort of one key message to them?
Throw away your risk matrices. The thing about risk matrices and risk appetite statements and risk registers is it is a false sense of security. You may have those documents, but those documents are not doing anything for you. Make sure that risk is integrated into your ways of working. The other dangerous thing too, and this is me with my lawyer hat on, is, if you have your risk matrix and your risk register and your risk appetite statement, and the proverbial poop hits the fan, which we know it's going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. You have all of these really shiny, fancy documents, but you're not actually doing anything with them. It's going to be double the problem for you, because not only now are you going to be dealing with whatever went wrong, when the auditors, the investigators come in, they're going to be looking at all these fancy documents going, but you had all of this here. Why didn't you follow it? Again, trustees need to get reporting, and we talked about this earlier. Trustees can ask dynamic questions to get dynamic answers. Don't just ask for the risk matrix to be updated every quarter. It doesn't do anything. Ask your leadership team to explain to you what has changed in your landscape. How have you changed how you're implementing your programs in response to what's going on in your contextual operating environment? Ask them to describe to you what has changed in your operating environment.
Say there's a trustee listening right now that wants to get in contact with you to understand a little bit more. What's the best way of doing that?
I'm on LinkedIn. Yeah, I'd love to connect with people. I've had so many amazing conversations with people.
Well, thank you so much, Sabrina. It's been absolutely lovely to talk to you.
I hope so. Thank you so much, Michala. This has been so much fun.